Jackson Wade pushed open the doors of Lissen Noir, the city's most exclusive dining hall. His clothes were rumpled from the day, his shoes dusted with the grit of the streets. Above him, chandeliers spilled golden light, but below, every head turned. The stairs were sharp, cutting through him like glass. Marbel Sloan, the queen of this velvet kingdom, let her gaze travel slowly over him, slicing away his presence piece by piece. Her voice, smooth and cold as carved marble, floated into the silence. "We don't serve people like you." From the corner, Chester Vale chuckled, his laugh just loud enough to carry, like a cue for the rest of the room. A ripple stirred through the tables, silverware clicked softly against porcelain. A chorus of concealed applause. Ezra Pike, the young maitre d', stood frozen at his podium, menu trembling in his hand. His face twitched with the battle between duty and fear. Jackson didn't flinch. Instead, he laid a sleek black card on the counter, the kind that opened doors in every city on Earth. Light caught the surface, heavy, undeniable. Marbel's lips curled into a thin, mocking smile. "Fake ones are everywhere." Two guards stepped forward, their hands pressing against his shoulder. The room hushed, complicit in its silence. Jackson didn't resist. To fight was pointless. It wasn't just his body they were trying to push out. It was his very right to exist in that space. In that moment, he felt himself being erased. But inside, a tide rose. His mind carried him back to another life. The hiss of steam, the sting of soap, the suffocating nights when the only thing he owned was his labor. He remembered the endless nights behind swinging kitchen doors, sleeves rolled to his elbows, while detergent chewed through raw skin. The smell clung to him, a chemical ghost that no water could wash away. Steam from the dish machine soaked his hair. The world measured men by dirt under their nails, not the fire in their hearts. That proof lived in him, proof that dignity could be stolen in an instant, that a human being could vanish behind a wall of indifference. But also proof that if power ever landed in his hands, he would never forget what it felt like to be unseen. There came a night when Jackson knew he couldn't stay in that corner anymore. The walls stank of damp bread and grease. The cot was nothing but a folded blanket on cracked tiles. He counted what remained. $50 in worn bills, folded so many times they had turned thin as tissue. That was all he had. No backup, no safety net, no one waiting for him. Just a decision, he would not rot there. So he walked, miles on blistered feet, his shoes splitting at the seams, hunger gnawing at his ribs like an animal. He knocked on doors, begged for shifts nobody wanted. Most rejected him before he could finish a sentence. But then, a small cafe, nothing elegant, nothing polished, opened its doors. At first he carried plates before he ever carried dreams. He balanced trays, wiped endless crumbs, memorized tables. But even then he watched. He studied how the manager charmed guests, how the cash drawer clicked open, how suppliers arrived in the quiet hours with crates of fruit. On scraps of paper he scribbled details, each one a thread in the fabric of a vision no one else could see. Slowly he rose, from clearing dishes to arranging schedules, from invisible shadow to someone trusted with the pulse of the room. He asked questions others ignored, listened to complaints others dismissed, turned every lesson into a brick for the foundation he was building in silence. When the cafe slept, he stayed awake, pen in hand, sketching blueprints of a dream that felt impossible, yet alive. That dream wasn't survival. It wasn't even success. It was belonging. Scolded. Instead, he stepped in. If the shift was heavy, he worked beside them. If tips were thin, he slipped extra into their envelopes. Loyalty was never demanded. It was nurtured. His people stayed not because of contracts, but because they felt seen. Jackson knew their birthdays, their children's names, their fears whispered in tired voices. He understood what most owners never learned. Wages fade, but dignity lingers. The restaurant survived storms, broken pipes, weeks when the till barely covered the cost of flour. Yet it endured, because beneath the menu was a philosophy. Treat every plate with care, every person with respect. That seed grew into what became known as Jackson hospitality. Not luxury first, not profit first, dignity first. Long before the empire, before the billion-dollar headlines, there was simply a man wiping tables and choosing decency over indifference. And that choice outlasted everything. Now, Jackson Wade stood at the helm of an empire. Jackson hospitality stretched across continents, a constellation of restaurants praised for velvet service and gold-plated reviews. His name filled Forbes profiles, his wealth calculated down to the decimal. But fame was never his pursuit. He stayed distant. He refused galas, declined interviews, and avoided plastering his face on banners. It wasn't humility. It was strategy. Jackson had learned early that masks slip when power enters the room. Compliments bloom too easily. Service sharpens unnaturally. Truth disappears when respect is demanded by title. So he chose invisibility. In staff rooms across the globe, his name was spoken with awe and distance. But his face was a blur. That was how he preferred it. A stranger could find honesty in places a CEO never would. And when he entered his own establishments, he dressed down, blending into the crowd. He allowed the maitre d' to dismiss him, allowed servers to glance past as if he were nothing more than a... Finalized the acquisition. Lissen Noir, a chain of glittering temples to fine dining, now belonged to him. Yet no one within its crystal-lit halls knew it. The deal closed without ceremony, without press, without champagne toasts. He preferred silence. Announcements would have only distorted what mattered. His name was hidden beneath subsidiaries, his signature buried under shell companies. Until on paper the purchase looked like nothing more than the faceless maneuver of an investment group. But in truth, every chandelier, every velvet chair, every paycheck now answered to him. For his reservation he chose a false name, booking a table without title or fanfare. His assistant, Tamsin Crowell, moved with the precision of a surgeon, handling contracts, disguising emails, covering every legal trail. Her task was simple: make him invisible. Jackson had no interest in the rehearsed version of hospitality. What he sought was the raw, unpolished truth, the kind that revealed itself only when staff believed the guest had no influence, no clout, no reason to be treated with care. Every layer of secrecy was deliberate, a countdown to the moment of exposure. He wasn't walking into Lissen Noir to dine. He was walking into a test. When his phone buzzed, Tamsin's voice came steady, precise, assuring him there would be no trace. No one will recognize you. Not a single thread ties back. He leaned against the cool brick of the alley wall, his gaze fixed on the polished doors glowing across the street. His reply was clipped, almost weightless. Good. He looked down at his scuffed shoes, the kind a maitre d' would never associate with wealth, the soles thinning from years of use. Memory rushed in, bare feet on cold tiles, suds stinging raw skin after hours of dishwashing. The contrast stung. Power had built walls around him now, but he hadn't forgotten what it felt like, its own reflection. When he stepped inside, the illusion of power would be forced to confront something it could not polish away. The presence of a man it believed had no place there. The doors gave a soft hiss as he entered, breaking the rhythm of the room. For a moment, silence rippled. A man in a bow tie glanced up, his eyes scanning Jackson's attire before his lip curled and he turned back to his plate. A woman in silk whispered faintly to her companion, her smile carrying more cruelty than words. An older man lowered his newspaper with ritual care, his eyes locking on Jackson before he shook his head slowly, as though resigned to a story he had already seen play out. Conversations dipped, cutlery softened. Every gaze landed on him, wordless but heavy. "You don't belong here." Jackson's stride never faltered. His face betrayed nothing, though each glance cut as clearly as if spoken aloud. The chandeliers still shimmered, the wine still poured, but beneath the elegance hung cruelty. In their eyes he was no guest. He was an intruder, erased before a word had been exchanged. He had not entered a restaurant, but a stage where every gaze was a verdict. What they didn't know was that the man they were excluding already owned the stage itself. From a side hallway, the rhythm of heels struck sharply against polished stone, slicing the hush. Marbel Sloan emerged, her figure taut with authority, her presence sculpted as deliberately as the chandeliers. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. In her mind, true power moved slowly, allowing silence to stretch and bend around it. Her eyes found Jackson instantly, scanning him with surgical precision from scuffed shoes to creased jacket, pausing long enough for disdain to settle like frost. Her voice came low and smooth, yet edged with steel. "We don't serve guests like you." It wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. The words were knives wrapped in silk, cut then spreading outward until nearby diners joined, eager to belong to the cruelty. Polished forks struck plates too hard, their sound ringing like applause for his humiliation. A wineglass clinked sharply, and a murmur of amusement followed, thin and knowing, until the air itself seemed to smirk. Screens flickered on, one after another, careful angles, discreet hands, turning a living moment into content. For them, this wasn't an injustice. It was an intermission act between courses. At the host stand, Ezra Pike hovered with his fingers inches above the keyboard, lips parted as the instinct to check pressed against the fear to obey. One look from Marbel, cool, wordless, absolute, pinned him back into silence. His hand retreated. His role narrowed to compliance, the kind that chews at a person from the inside out. Jackson stood without moving, rooted in a calm that felt older than the room, older than every chandelier above him. His gaze stayed level, neither lowered in apology nor raised in challenge. He had learned long ago that silence, held steadily, can strip varnish off a scene faster than outrage. But silence also illuminated the room's truth. Not one diner rose. No voice cut across the laughter. Their stillness was a vote, and in it the mockery became communal, the erasure collective. He absorbed each glance, each chuckle, each deliberate omission, gathering them the way a careful mind gathers facts, evidence to be presented later when it mattered most. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and steady, resonant enough to cut the gauze. "I have a reservation. The name is Jackson Group." The room paused, but only for a breath. Marbel didn't glance at the screen, didn't lift a finger toward confirmation. Arms folded, head tilted, she delivered her answer wrapped in disdain. "I think you've come to the wrong place. It wasn't a mistake. It was a ruling." A chuckle flared from a corner. A guest performed a theatrical, set a single card on the polished podium. Heavy, matte, unmistakable, the centurion figure gleamed beneath the chandelier, its edge catching light like a blade. A collective intake of breath passed through the room, subtle, yet audible to anyone listening for the truth. Ezra's eyes widened. Recognition leapt ahead of reason. He knew what that card meant, knew it wasn't something an imposter conjured out of thin air. Marbel didn't blink. She tilted her chin the smallest degree and let a half-smile unfurl. Fake cards are everywhere these days. The line landed like a polished insult, and the tension snapped into entertainment. A whistle cut across the room, followed by neat, restrained chuckles, the careful laughter of people trained to enjoy humiliation without appearing crass. The proof lay in plain view, yet the room had already agreed not to see it. That was the truest sentence of the evening. Ezra's throat tightened. His hand hovered, trembled, hovered again. Every instinct begged him to pull up the reservation, to drag the truth into daylight. The weight of Marbel's smirk pressed him down like a thumb on a scale. He said nothing, did nothing. Jackson's eyes stayed steady, not pleading, not angry, just watchful. He hadn't placed the card to prove himself. He had placed it to see what they'd do with proof when it stood inches from their faces. The answer arrived. Evidence meant nothing in a room where arrogance had pre-written the script. The air thickened until each breath tasted of judgment. The laughter softened but never left. It idled there, sharp and poisonous, hiding behind crystal and polite smiles. A woman leaned toward her companion, voice pitched to cut without being claimed. How shameful. Who does he think he's fooling? Across the aisle, an older man folded his newspaper with surgical care, holding back a smile as he shook his head, dismissal performed as ritual. Phones lifted with casual indifference, tiny red lights blinking like patient eyes. What began at one podium flowed onto 1,000 feeds, stripped of context, packaged as spectacle. Jackson's silence stretched past, accepted the verdict with relief, because it freed them from responsibility. Ezra's chest rose and fell unevenly. His hand twitched toward truth one last time, but Marbel's glance iced him where he stood. He looked to the nearest tables, a plea flickering and dying in his eyes. No one met his gaze. Complicity widened, heavy as lead, broken only by the soft clink of glassware. Shoes tapped against marble, measured, deliberate. Two uniformed men approached, shoulders squared, faces scrubbed of thought. They reached him like a tide that never questions where it's going. The first laid a firm hand on Jackson's shoulder. Not violence, possession. The unspoken message pressed into his bones. You don't belong here. We decide how this ends. Heads tilted toward the theater. Anticipation glittered in half-hidden smiles. Phones adjusted, seeking the best angle to capture a man reduced to nothing. But reduction is a trick of perspective. Jackson didn't resist. Shoulders squared, arms loose. He let his own steps set the rhythm. Each footfall on marble tolled like a bell. Laughter stirred at the edges, soft, muffled, calculated to sting without cost. Screens lifted higher, blue light catching the line of his jaw, eager to trap a picture of defeat. They thought they were collecting proof of his smallness. He knew they were documenting their own. Marbel stood statuesque, arms crossed, pleased with an outcome that required no scrutiny. Her power felt confirmed by the hush that wrapped her like velvet. Ezra stared at the monitor and saw nothing. Shame swelled and swallowed itself whole, leaving him smaller for the effort. At the doors, the revolving glass sighed open. Jackson's reflection broke and reformed across panels, a man shattering and assembling in the same breath, until the night gathered him in. Silence held. No voice. Thrill. Another bite, another joke, another stranger turned into content. Hashtags sprouted like weeds. Fake VIP. Beggar with a card. Not one of us. In his chair, Chester Vale lounged and grinned, tapping fast, uploading the clip he'd captured like a trophy. A heartbeat later, it was out in the world, gathering hearts and laughing faces and comments sharpened to cut. To him, the evening had been upgraded, fine wine, good company, and now the pleasure of mockery amplified by 1,000 eyes he'd never meet. Marbel watched the spread with a queen's satisfaction, her smile widening in the chandelier's reflection. The room had become her jury, and they had blessed her verdict. She hadn't just silenced a stranger. She'd secured applause from beyond these walls. Behind the host's stand, Ezra Pike sat rigid, fingers clenched so hard his knuckles blanched, sweat dampening his collar. His gaze pinged from glowing screens to Marbel's triumphant poise, to guests raining their cruelty with exquisite manners. Something was wrong in a way that scraped bone. While the room celebrated exclusion, a thin wire of shame tightened around his ribs. He couldn't name it yet, but each click, each low laugh, each hashtag spreading like fire pushed the feeling harder. They had all participated in something that would not stay hidden. Outside, winter pressed its cold palm against the city. Jackson stood beneath the golden letters of Lissen Noir, their polished glow spilling across his shoulders like a crown he hadn't asked for. His breath rose in steady clouds, each exhale measured, controlled. He drew his phone, dialed without a tremor, and when the line opened, his voice carried no anger. Only iron. Tamsin, assemble the full board. 20 minutes. The pause on the other end said everything. Then Tamsin's reply, clear and sure. Understood. He slipped the phone away and kept still, not weary but waiting. His eyes reflected. Jackson weighed among top CEOs. Then photographs, clear, close, impossible to mistake. Ezra's breath snagged. The face staring back was the same man they'd marched through the revolving doors, the same worn jacket, the same steady eyes. No room for doubt. The beggar they mocked, Marbel's cast-off, was the owner of the ground under their feet. His chest tightened, his heart hammered as if trying to escape the cage of his ribs. Sweat traced his temple. The air thinned, as though the chandeliers themselves were swallowing the oxygen. He looked up toward the glass doors where the man had vanished and replayed everything, the laughter, the lifted phones, Marbel's smirk, Chester's jeer. Each moment shifted weight. They weren't jokes anymore. They were exhibits. The truth detonated silently, scattering his certainty until only fragments remained. They hadn't expelled an intruder. They had humiliated a sovereign. And the instant he understood, Ezra knew this wasn't over. It hadn't even begun. He swallowed against the dryness, scraping his throat. Headlines still burned across the screen, Jackson Wade's face again and again, a calm inevitability. Just feet away, Marbel floated through congratulations, her smile chiming like glass, utterly unaware of the weather changing beyond her reach. Diners returned to their plates, knives sliding through fillets, voices purring with the smug comfort of victory. Phones buzzed with the growing wave of tags, each ping another nail in their blindness. None of them knew. Not one realized that the man they erased was already coming back, not as a guest, but as their judge. Ezra's certainty swelled until it pressed painful against his ribs. He almost spoke, almost tore a hole in the beautiful lie suffocating the room. but fear cinched tight and the words died. All he could do was stare at the revolving doors and hear his own heartbeat drum the same sentence until it filled his skull. He will come back. The door turned, glass panels slicing the chandelier's gold into ribbons. Heads lifted. Curiosity snapped into disbelief as Jackson Wade stepped inside again. The jacket was still worn, the shoes still scuffed, but his eyes had hardened into something. Courtroom, every guest an unwilling witness. He hadn't returned to be accepted. He had returned to show the room where power actually lived, and the silence admitted what no one wanted to say. They felt the balance tilt. He crossed the floor unhurried, the hush trailing him like a shadow. At the VIP table, the seat reserved for legacy, for money that announces itself, he pulled out a chair and sat as if it had been carved for him. No preface, no apology. He drew his phone, the worn sleeve brushing linen, swiped, dialed, and set it to speaker. The voice on the line rang with boardroom clarity, amplified under the chandeliers. Good evening, Mr. Wade. The board is assembled, and the meeting has begun. The sentence struck the room like a dropped curtain. Heads turned. Forks froze mid-air. The hum of petty cruelty curdled into stunned quiet. Eyes widened, mouths unmade their smiles, and every guest saw, too late, that the man they had mocked was not an intruder at all. He was the owner calling his house to order. He was the very force behind the empire they worshipped without question. Across the room, Chester Vale's smirk caved in on itself, bravado draining from his face like wine from shattered crystal. Ezra Pike's chest rose and fell with the strange twin pull of relief and dread. He had suspected the truth, but hearing it spoken aloud left nowhere to hide. Marbel Sloan stood rigid beneath the chandeliers, her composure unspooling thread by thread. Color fled her cheeks. Her lips parted and closed again, soundless, as if authority itself had slipped from her throat. Jackson said nothing. He didn't have to. His name had already done what no argument could, pulled the mask from the room and left them staring at the truth they had refused to see. Ezra's fingers hovered for only a heartbeat before moving, compelled by the gravity of Jackson's presence. The system bloomed open, the monitor's cold lights, visible pattern, stripped the glamour from the lie. Gasps rippled from staff peering over the rim of the host stand, whispers spreading like stress fractures through glass. Ezra's hands shook, but he kept scrolling. The text grew sharper, each detail shaving away another layer of illusion. There it was, plain as ledger lines. Cruelty signed in cursive and hidden behind linen and crystal. This wasn't humiliation. It was revelation. The empire she thought she ruled had just turned its record against her. From the far side of the room a figure stirred. Ivy Monroe, a pastry hand who moved so quietly she was often mistaken for air, stepped forward on trembling legs. Flour still dusted the hem of her apron. She twisted her fingers together, then lifted her chin and let a small voice carry the weight of truth. She called me a stain in the kitchen. The words landed like a blade. The room froze around them, forks suspended, glasses hovering, breath caught in a collective throat. Under the chandelier's white fire, Marbel's face tightened. Her mouth opened to protest, to reassert the script, but sound failed her. Ivy lowered her gaze, not in shame but in resolve. The confession was not loud, not dramatic, yet it rang with the kind of precision that outlives denial. A few guests stared at Ivy with startled respect. More turned slowly toward Marbel with suspicion that hardened into certainty. A hand rose from the knot of staff. A young waiter, sleeves tugged down to hide more than they revealed, spoke with a taut, steady voice. She canceled my shift. Said I wasn't fit to serve because of a small tattoo. Before silence could seal itself again, a junior cook stepped forward. Grease stains splashed across his whites like a map of long nights. She told me I'd never be more than a shadow here, that I should be grateful to wash the pans. Another voice followed. His thumb stabbed delete. The deletion didn't erase what every face remembered. He shifted, suddenly fascinated by the neat fold of his napkin, shoulders folding inward. The first to sneer was now the first to vanish into himself. Around him others mirrored the retreat. Glasses lowered to linen, forks sat down without a sound. Smirks collapsed into tight, bloodless lines. The room that had feasted on mockery now starved for dignity. No one dared to laugh. No one could look Jackson in the eye and still believe in the lie. Chester clasped his hands until his knuckles blanched, trying to shrink, to become furniture, to be anything but the man who'd cheered the cruelty. Guilt clung to him like smoke, visible in every nervous swallow, in every half-breath that couldn't quite land. The crowd abandoned Marbel, and with her, they abandoned her choir boy too. The transformation was sudden and unmistakable. Not an audience anymore, but witnesses, involuntary, indelible. The silence that followed held the shape of judgment. Jackson's voice cut through it, steady, unflinching, each syllable weighted. 17 complaints, 6 confidential settlements, 1 person responsible. He did not raise his tone. Numbers delivered cold hit harder than rage. Marbel's control snapped back in a sharp, panicked lash. Those were for the brand, for the restaurant's image. Jackson did not let the excuse breathe. No, he said, iron flat. That was cruelty in lipstick. Malice posed as discipline. The words cleaved the air. A ripple shivered through the diners, a collective flinch at a truth too clean to argue with. Ezra stood a step away, shirt clinging, breath small. The room leaned forward, not for spectacle now, but because dread had weight, and it pulled everything toward the center. Jackson no longer sounded like a man defending himself. He sounded like inevitability. Marbel reached for one last refuge. Anyone can type up a complaint. Screens can be forged. You can't prove those are real. The plea undercut her own words, thin and wavering. Jackson didn't answer. Tied to payment records. This wasn't a document someone could fabricate. It was the business remembering itself. Marbel's face drained to gray. She tried to speak. Her lips trembled and failed. Every name on the screen stood as a witness. Every line read like a verdict. Each one curved back to her. Her heels clicked once, twice, and she edged away from the glow as if distance could dim a truth already etched into the room. But the light followed. The silence thickened. Evidence had stopped being abstract. It had become undeniable. Jackson never needed to shout. The files did the speaking, each entry hammering home the same conclusion. Marbel Sloan's cruelty wasn't rumor. It was record. From the back, a broad-shouldered figure stepped forward, chef's whites smudged with heat and day-long labor. Dorian Halt, head of the kitchen, carried a gravity that bent the air. He commanded flame and steel. Tonight, he brought confession. His voice came gravel rough. I have seen her humiliate staff in front of diners, he said, slow, deliberate, unflinching. And I stayed silent. That silence is my fault. The words hit like a mallet on stone. Even the chandeliers seemed to bow. Authority had spoken, not to defend, but to accept the cost of looking away. A murmur rolled through the guests, not mockery but unease. Silence, it turned out, hadn't lived only in the shadows. It had nested in the kitchen's heart. Dorian's gaze fell. Shame moved behind his eyes like a slow, honest fire. For a breath, he wasn't a chef. He was a man hauling the weight of every insult he'd let pass in service of the next plate. The admission was brief, and it changed everything. If the pillar acknowledged the crack, denial had no scaffolding left. Jackson rose slightly, eyes sweeping the hall. His voice was low and certain, more accused, cornered, unmade. Judgment wasn't approaching. It stood in the room. The spell broke with a sharp, splintering cry. "You don't understand anything," she shouted, hands cutting the air. "I protected the image. I preserved the reputation. Without me, this place would crumble." The words ricocheted off marble and linen, but found no echo. The chandeliers blazed white and indifferent. Faces remained still. A man in a tuxedo shook his head once, disappointment laid deep. A woman lowered her glass and closed her eyes, shame cooling the heat in her cheeks. Marbel's gaze snapped toward the staff, plea bleeding into her voice. "I carried the burden so you wouldn't have to." Every harsh word, every cut shift, it was discipline. It was for you. No one moved. Hands stayed at sides. Their silence, once trained by fear, had turned into something stronger. It condemned without flourish. Her breath hitched, power thinning to a rasp. "Don't you see? I was protecting what we built." The sentence fell brittle, breaking before it reached anyone's heart. Defiance. Defiance, once her weapon, now rang as desperation. The room had moved beyond persuasion. It had become truth's climate, and in that air, excuses couldn't breathe. Jackson rose to his full height. He didn't bring heat, he brought boundary. Luxury is not built on stripping away another person's dignity. The line landed like iron laid flat. It rang because it was simple. The chandeliers kept their white glow. No one dared look away from it. Guests who had smirked only minutes before now stared at linen or hands or nothing at all. Marbel's eyes shone, the first fracture of tears loosening what command remained. For years she'd cut with words. Now a single sentence cut her down, not in fury, but in clarity. She looked left and right for a lifeline, a nod, a whisper, one ally. None came. Staff who had cowered stood. Even the light felt harsher, the white glare showing every edge she used to dim. Words rose and died in her throat. What defense could stand against a name erased in real time? Around her, the room breathed as a single thing, a quiet intake, a hush of awe and consequence. This wasn't spectacle anymore. It was accountability applied with the cool efficiency of truth. She stood in the wreck of authority. The fall had taken years to build and seconds to finish. Silence stretched taut. Those who mocked earlier had grown the stillest. Chester Vale bent low over a phone he didn't touch, the glow a flimsy shield against a reality that didn't blink. Near the back, Ivy Monroe hugged a tray to her chest like a breastplate. Her breaths came sharp, the first clean air after a long plunge. The room's silence vindicated her more than any speech could. Ezra stood fixed in place. His eyes burned not with fear, but with release, the sting of a tight knot loosening. He had watched arrogance steer this room. He watched it now as the air cleared. No toast rose. No whisper dared. The quiet itself became a sentence. Every bowed head added another line to it. Lissen Noir, its glitter peeled back, stood bare. This reckoning wasn't just hers. It belonged to everyone who watched and nodded and laughed, and is now out of alibis. Jackson turned to Ezra, voice even, gaze unwavering. "You hesitated," he said, each word placed with care. "But at least you still felt." Ezra's mouth opened on a thread of voice. I'm sorry." The apology trembled but didn't break. He braced for the weight that had crushed others. Jackson gave one measured nod. "Silence is a mistake," he said. "Today you're not silent." It wasn't absolution. It was a door. Ezra's chest lifted on a ragged breath. Something sparked where the gilded walls. The night cracked open. Screens lit with banners. Then with split screens, the escort out alongside the return. Humiliation beside revelation. Context snapping into place in minutes. Hashtags flooded and fused, not in cruelty but in chorus, drawing the same sentence in different hands. Respect over luxury. Truth at the table. Memes, debates, declarations. Noise but aimed toward a single chord. Dignity isn't for sale, and it doesn't vanish on command. Phones buzzed inside the dining room with the same current. Diners who had laughed now watched their own complicity mirrored back by millions. The world wasn't just watching, it was rendering judgment, and its echo matched the one already spoken under these lights. Luxury without humanity is a hollow stage. Jackson stood at the front, presence cutting cleanly through the room. His gaze swept guests and staff alike, weighing, not condemning. "I didn't come here to fire people," he said, voice even, deliberate. "I came to make sure the right ones remain." The words traveled like a stone across a still pond, ripples widening, unsettled and necessary. This wasn't anger, not vengeance. It was clarity. Glasses stayed still, eyes lifted. For the first time tonight, silence felt reverent rather than complicit. The battle had changed shape. It wasn't about one humiliation or a single dismissal anymore. It was about what Lissen Noir would become, and who among them had the courage to belong to that future. "Power means nothing if it is never tested," he said. The truth landed heavy and bright, stripping gold leaf from the room until only people remained. A few diners bowed their heads in quiet assent. Ezra's whisper slipped out, almost to himself. "He's right." At the edge, Ivy wiped her face and found a small, honest smile. Gratitude loosened from grief. No derision remained, only